From the CISO Series, it's cybersecurity headlines.
Infamous hacker USDOD possibly arrested in Brazil. Nearly 400 U.S. healthcare organizations hit with ransomware over the past 12 months. And how did anonymous Sudan achieve 35,000 DDoS attacks in a year? These are some of the stories that my colleagues and I have selected from this past week's cybersecurity headlines. And now we get a chance for some insight, opinion, and expertise from our guest, Steve Person, the CISO at Cambia Health. Steve, thanks so much for being here. I got to ask, how was your week in cybersecurity?
Hey, Rich, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. My week in cybersecurity was fulfilling, exhausting and fulfilling. I got to spend some time traveling back to the Midwest to spend time with some of my colleagues across the blues, and then also spend a little bit of time with some of the folks that work on the cyber insurance side of our industry. So very fulfilling and happy to be home.
Well, I'm hoping to be the cherry on top of the fulfilling Sunday that was your week. One thing that always leaves me fulfilled is our sponsor for today, Conveyor. Get instant AI answers to any spooky security questionnaires. Remember, you can join us on YouTube Live. Do so, go to CISOSeries.com, hit that events drop down, and look for the Cybersecurity Headlines Week in Review image. Click on it to join us, and then you can contribute in our chat. We're going to get some comments up on the screen. Have a good time. I already see CCL, Kevin Farrell, and our own Sean Kelly in there. By the way, I don't want to put any pressure on you here, Steve, but Sean is already saying you're the best of the best. So that's my expectation going into this. And so I know you'll be the best.
Well, thank you, Sean. No pressure, and the checks in the mail, buddy.
Very nice, very nice. Just a quick reminder that all of Steve's opinions are his own, not necessarily those of his employer. Now that we got that out of the way, we got about 20 minutes. Let's jump into the stories. First one here, definitely one that caught my eye this week. Infamous hacker USDOD possibly arrested in Brazil. Law enforcement officials in Brazil have arrested a hacker allegedly behind intrusions on their own systems who may have been the person responsible for some recent high-profile cyber attacks, including the FBI's InfraGard platform in December 2022, Airbus in September 2023, the US EPA in April of this year, and the huge data haul of National Public Data last December. Basically, a greatest hits of cybersecurity headlines there from USDOD. There is a lot of corroborating evidence to suggest this person, a 33-year-old Brazilian, whose name seems to be Juan GB, is the person behind the moniker. So Steve, Brian Krebs, writing just this morning, added to the intrigue, suggested that a Portuguese news outlet learned of the hacker's real identity after being given a draft of a detailed, non-public report produced by the security firm CrowdStrike. It's cause for celebration if this is indeed the right culprit, but the damage has been done in a long history of, like we just said, high-profile attacks. I'm curious, how can we reconcile the extent of the damage caused by data breaches with punishments metered out by the world's laws?
Yeah, no, first of all, it's always a victory when cyber justice is served, right? So bravo to everyone who was involved in that, the folks at CrowdStrike, everybody. You talked about sort of the worldwide law courts, right? And that's really important when we think about cybercrime. This Brazilian case is actually something of an anomaly, right? Most organized crime, ransomware, et cetera, as we know, actually originates in jurisdictions that ignore or even kind of encourage cybercrime against the West. Which then you start to get into all the complexity of international politics and geopolitical situations. And, it's not the case that it's as easy to go after some of these folks as we all wish it was, right? So I always kind of come back to, as a security leader, what can I do? What can we do in our own sphere of influence? And so I think there's kind of two things, right? One is to tilt the economics of cybercrime kind of back in our favor. Second is to support law enforcement in bringing these international cyber criminals to justice. The second one's much more complicated, but if we focus on the first one for a second, right, that economic side, that's where we have the most control. That's where we have the most levers as security leaders. It's really about taking away the financial incentive, right? So how do we do that? Well, first, we have to make it harder and more expensive to compromise our technology environments. That's sort of the obvious part, but I wouldn't say it except for we're still seeing failures in that space, right? We continue to see devastating attacks that are sourced from these relatively low cost or almost no cost initial access vectors, like the absence of strong MFA, like taking too long to patch critical vulnerabilities, like misconfigurations. So some of these kind of blocking and tackling things that we always harp on, they're still out there, they're still happening. And as long as those things are happening, it's not expensive to get in, right? So first of all, I think it's just about eliminating those self-inflicted wounds. And then second, and just as important, is we've got to put our organizations into a position of resilience so that even in the worst case, we're not having to pay that ransom. Because we all know that ransom essentially finances the next wave of criminal activity. And so we've just got to get ourselves in a position where we don't ever have to even contemplate paying. And I think sometimes we don't spend as much time on that second part because, I mean, one, it can feel a little bit defeatist, right? I hate to kind of think, well, it's just not a matter of if, but when. But that's the truth, right? Like we have to think that way. But second, it requires some energy that and some resource, right, from technology teams and business teams that don't necessarily report to us, don't typically report to us as security leaders. So you have to kind of design our resilience and recovery capabilities on the assumption that we could be breached, no matter how hard we work on the prevention side, right? That's where you go to security conferences, you go talk to your friends, like it's all about prevention. How do we stop the bad thing from happening? And I think we have to focus more on that second bit around resilience. Whether that's automating recovery capabilities, exercising them more regularly, adopting our role really as business resilience leaders.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen that conversation start to
Yeah,
shift and expand into
yeah,
that realm. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That involves talking, working with business continuity planning, working with, deeper into IT when you're talking about, backup and recovery and all that kind of stuff. And those are like, we talk about the difficulties of, just talking to your direct reports and stuff like that as a CISO, let alone kind of spreading out throughout the business. So definitely something to keep in mind. And and I'm glad that we are seeing that shift and that realization. Maybe a little late, but better late than never. And of course, David Cross always wants us to have a CISO Justice League, which whoever gets to be the Martian Manhunter really is the one that lucks out in that CISO ring. Next up here, anonymous Sudan masterminds indicted. This past Wednesday, a federal grand jury unsealed an indictment against two Sudanese brothers, aged 22 and 27, who are allegedly behind the cyber criminal outfit. It's known to have conducted a record 35,000 DDoS attacks in a single year, including those that targeted Microsoft services in June 2023. Experts, including Tom Scholl, vice president of Amazon Web Services, which was instrumental in the takedown, said his team were a bit surprised about how brazen they were and by the ease with which they were impacting high-profile targets. I mean, that's always been the moniker with Anonymous Sudan is, just kind of really, really going for it with seemingly very limited resources. So, Steve, those are definitely some choice words, being surprised by how easily two brothers seem to have, made these DDoSes happen. CrowdStrike said Anonymous Sudan successfully stemmed from a combination of factors: a custom-built attack infrastructure hosted on rented servers with high bandwidth, sophisticated techniques for bypassing DDoS mitigation services, and the ability to quickly identify and exploit vulnerable API endpoints that, when overwhelmed with requests, would render services inoperable and disrupt user access. I'm curious, what are your thoughts regarding that assessment?
yeah. Maybe the thing that really stands out to me is it's kind of a sobering reminder that as we standardize and sort of commoditize controls like DDoS prevention, right? It's,
Hmm.
it's probably something where we sort of set it and forget it to a degree. But there are smart people out there who have all the scale and resources of hyper cloud, type of resources to go out there to look for creative ways to get around those controls. So we can't get complacent and comfortable, even if a control has been effective for a long time, that any single layer is going to be a silver bullet. So for me, it takes us kind of right back to defense in depth, zero trust, assume breach, where we assume that any single control could fail. And then we kind of ask ourselves, well, how would the subsequent controls perform if that first layer failed? It's a thought exercise I ask my team to do routinely when we stop an attempted attack at the front door. So let's say hypothetically 20 employees get a malicious phishing email. We block it at the mail gateway. Hooray, we all celebrate and go about our day. But, this situation illustrates we should actually look at some of those and say, well, what would happen if that first control failed? How would our EDR perform? How would our egress filtering perform? Whatever it is. So I always want to look at the next layers and what would happen then? How would the next controls kind of perform? And how far can we work through that kill chain, practically, and then learn and sort of reincorporate anything that we discover, back into our layers of controls.
That's something I've come to appreciate the difficulty of, is, trying to figure out what your actual assumptions are in cybersecurity, and like that the art of that is, or the method to figure that out can be surprisingly difficult, right? So it's testing, these industry standard services that we just don't have to worry about DDoSes anymore. Well, it turns out, a lot of that stuff, that's where people get creative. And it makes my job a lot more interesting reporting on the news, to be quite honest. All right, next up here, nearly 400 U.S. healthcare institutions hit with ransomware over the past 12 months. On Tuesday, Microsoft released a report revealing that between July 2023 and June 2024, 389 U.S.-based healthcare institutions were successfully hit with ransomware, causing network and system outages, delays in critical medical operations, and rescheduled appointments. The researchers said that the motives of Russian, North Korean, and Iranian cybercriminals appear to have shifted from destruction to financial gain. The report did yield some positive news, showing that the percentage of ransomware attacks that reached the encryption stage had decreased significantly over the past 2 years. So, Steve, we reported this week on the Boston Children's Health Physicians Organization suffering a ransomware attack. From your position as CISO within the healthcare industry, are you seeing progress with regard to protecting against cyber attacks, managing them, or recovering from them?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to just acknowledge, right, is that I really appreciate the complexity of managing security in the clinical setting, right? So we're on the, my current role, I'm on the insurance side. I've been on the clinical side in the past. It's a truly unique environment with the highest stakes, right? Life safety. And I have so much respect for security leaders in those hospital systems and clinics and specialty care settings. The good news, I think, is that hospitals have always been focused on downtime procedures. So they're coming into this, this is not a new language for them. They have a culture and a process perspective that anticipates these things. But it doesn't really matter if it's sourced by cyber activity or something else. Traditionally, it's not been cyber activity. I think the bad news is that the frequency of outages from cyber activities is much greater than what you typically kind of drill for around floods and earthquakes and natural disasters. So I think I've seen improvement is the ability to recover more quickly than maybe 5 or 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. Now there's some big notable exceptions to that we've seen, right? That's not across the board, but on the whole, I think, hospital organizations, clinical organizations have rightly begun investing again back on that resilience side alongside prevention, but not taking for granted that IT will always be up. The second thing I'd say, there was a comment in the article about like a breach coaching and do you bring those folks in? I think whatever you do, anything you can do proactively, right, with kind of that assume breach mindset is going to pay dividends if you end up having an incident. So whether it's tabletops or automating your recovery procedures or non-technical things like communications and breach response, it's all the right thing to do, right? You do not want to be talking to the coach for the very first time on game day.
That's a really good point. And it's always struck me the difficulty with this, and I can see the resilience paying dividends because we've one of the major themes here, right, that we've seen over the past like year and a half is organizations just coming out and saying, listen, paying the ransom is the cost of doing business, right? I have to have uptime. I can't have all my car dealerships out for months on end because we're the software provider for them or something like that. And that feels so much more acute in a healthcare setting where we're not just talking about dollars and cents here. We're talking about lives and
Right.
that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, bringing that resilience conversation and building like starting with that as your foundation and building back into prevention, which again, I know is like a whole morass of unique situations for that particular sector. It makes it seem more possible than when you're just looking at this as a whole with all of the just incredibly specific things that healthcare has to deal with, and that there's no universal, right? Like a hospital is different than a clinic, than a doctor's office, and that kind of stuff. That there's such this wide array of environments that you're also dealing with as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, another thing I'll sometimes mention is like it's much, imagine your threat model if all of, so much of your infrastructure is sitting out in public 24/7, right? And connected directly to life safety. Like you can't prevent the nurse from walking up to the nursing station and doing what they need to do. But there's also, members of the public wandering through there all day. It's a very complicated environment. And I really appreciate the complexity of it and the people who do that work.
Well, and it's just great to hear that that we are seeing progress, right? It's not sitting still. I mean, there's all sorts of motivations for having that done. I'm still glad to see that it happens given the sophistication of threat actor that we're dealing with. And, they're looking to make a buck too.
Yeah. And I think, it's not in the sort of the article, but there are financial incentives being sort of bantied about, right, in proposed legislation that would potentially help, especially some of the smaller, critical access and rural healthcare organizations, make some of those investments. If you think about what I said with sort of the self-inflicted wounds, right? Like maybe sort of focusing on those most critical things that we know are sort of leading to the low cost, low complexity attacks. I think anything we can do to sort of shore up the resource side of it is important too.
And CCL is in agreement in our chat. Completely agree. Everyone will be breached at some point. So we need to recover faster with the least amount of disruption. Well distilled, CCL. Thank you for that. Before we move on to our next story, I want to spend a few moments with our sponsor for today, Conveyor. It's spooky season, and nothing scarier than all of your account execs asking if you're done with their customer security questionnaires. Don't worry, Conveyor is here to help. Conveyor's market-leading AI automates the most time-consuming parts of customer security reviews, answering security questionnaires and sharing security documents like your SOC 2 with customers. Get instant AI answers to questionnaires and host an enterprise-grade trust center where customers can download documents and self-serve answers to their own questions. And the horror show. Try it for free at conveyor.com. That's conveyor.com. 175 million Amazon customers now use Passkeys. Amazon announced Tuesday that over 175 million customers are using Passkeys since they rolled out the feature about a year ago. Passkeys, of course, digital credentials tied to biometric controls or pins and stored with a secure chip on devices, things like phones, computers, USB security keys. You've probably encountered one by this point. One drawback of Passkeys, though, is that they've not been portable, meaning you can't transfer them between devices or password managers, but that's about to change because the FIDO Alliance announced a new specification that makes Passkeys portable across different platforms and password managers. So, Steve, the FIDO Alliance estimates that 12 billion online accounts are now secured using Passkeys, which has resulted in a reduction in phishing and credential reuse eliminated, and are about 20% more successful than passwords or passwords plus a second factor. I'm curious, what are your observations about Passkey technology? Is it being, are you seeing that kind of deployment? I mean, 12 billion, that seems like a lot of devices out there. And are the lasting objections to this kind of more operationalize it, procedural, or is there anything deeper that we need to still keep an eye on?
Yeah, I mean, this is great news all around, right? I think, passkeys are one of these have your cake and eat it too situations where it's generally easier to use. And so the experience is better and also, significantly more secure, especially around this, credential reuse and just phishing credentials, right? So big win all the way around. Is there resistance? Of course, right? I think especially for people who interact with technology less frequently, the pace of change is always going to be a pain point, right? For maybe you and I, maybe we use Amazon all the time, right? Maybe it's the main place we go shopping. But if you're just interacting there, once a year, well, that's going to look a lot different. We know that a significant portion of successful attacks, I think the Verizon DBIR put it at like 65%, start with just using valid credentials, right? So that's huge. So if we can take a bite out of that apple, just imagine the impact we can have, right? And it kind of goes back to that economic thing, making it more expensive to obtain valid credentials. Fantastic. We're taking a big chunk out of it. We see more and more phishing OTPs and kind of attacker in the middle attacks. We're really having to acknowledge now that not all MFA is created equal, right? That's not really the silver bullet. Just like we said, maybe that DDoS prevention service is not the silver bullet, right? Similarly with MFA, right? We've got to evolve it, and passkeys are a great way to do that. I'd say
Real
just
quick, can I
yeah,
throw in this question
yeah.
from CCL here? He says, "Isn't the whole point of passkeys that they never leave your device, hence they can't be stolen?" This would not remove the biometric authentication aspect of this, correct? From what you know, Steve?
Right. Yeah. Based on what I know, right. It's just about making it easier. I think when you get a new device or something to actually make that transition simpler. Now, I do think, in terms of how FIDO implements this, and I'm not expert on the technical details of this latest change, but it is really important, right, that we make it easy enough for the valid user to make those things portable. But the fact that they're not super portable is actually one of their strengths. So that's a delicate line to walk.
Possible, but not easy on the security convenience spectrum, right?
Right, right. And hopefully those are few and far between events that you're having to, get a new device and exercise the portability of the passkey.
All right, and our last story for today: Hong Kong police bust fraudsters using deepfakes in romance scams. Hong Kong police have arrested 27 people for allegedly carrying out romance scams using deepfake face swapping technology. The scheme amassed roughly $46 million from victims in Hong Kong, mainland China, Taiwan, India, and Singapore. Authorities said the scammers made contact with victims through social media platforms and lured them in using AI generated photos of attractive individuals, or people they thought would be attractive, I guess. Then they turned to deepfake technology when victims requested video calls. Police seized computers, mobile phones, luxury watches, and over $25,000 in suspected crime proceeds from the operations headquarters. So, Steve, obviously, there's a message here about not trusting what you see or read online, but with romance scams, there's always the added layer of emotional vulnerability and attachment that makes people want to believe. I'm curious, this is still kind of new territory for us, an old scheme perhaps, but what's your take on this?
Yeah, I can barely even talk about this without having an emotional reaction myself, right? It's just infuriating and sort of heartbreaking how much of this type of activity happens. It's predatory. It's preying on our sort of the base instincts and some of the good things about being human, right? Loyalty and trust. And it's frankly just kind of aimed at our most vulnerable friends and neighbors who have those great qualities. I think one thing we can all do, I'll have a call to action here, right? I think we need to swing the pendulum with the folks in our sphere, right? Our friends, our family, our neighbors who are the most vulnerable, and really educate them in maybe sort of a shocking way, right? Because a lot of these scams will start with, well, hey, don't tell anyone about this, and we're on the inside, and don't, whatever you do, don't say anything. We need to let people know, like, if you ever hear something like that, it's a scam. Talk to us. I can be here as a trusted advisor. If it ever turns to talking about money, right? Any of these kind of digital interactions start to talk about money, stop, right? Stop then, call me. I'm at your disposal. I think that's the thing we have to do, because they really are preying on some of these base good instincts that people have. And I think there's a generational thing too, where, there's a lot of folks who were brought up in an environment where you trusted authorities. And if someone said they were an authority, you listened and you trusted them. And I know that gets a little bit away from the romance scam, but what we're seeing a lot right now in my part of the country is scams where they're pretending to be, police or law enforcement or the Department of Justice or whatever, or even like the Department of Treasury. And we need to protect your money, buy us some gold bars. And it's working, right? And so I think it's just about really sensitizing people from the seat of experts like we are, who are maybe oversensitized to some of this stuff.
Yeah, not taking just because we're used to seeing this. I said, we're, another, it's another deepfake story. We've seen this before. Well, yeah, I'm seeing this because I cover this in the news every day. But this is still seems like science fiction, I'm sure, to a lot of people.
Yes.
That this kind of stuff is possible. So yeah, that kind of taking on the educational aspect. I like that you have a positive spin of empowerment. Like, let's empower ourselves to be able to make better decisions on this. I absolutely love that. Before we get out of here, I want to spend just to acknowledge a couple comments we got in here real quick. Steve, if you don't mind, CCL had a question in going back to kind of the more medical context here, or the healthcare organization context. Any fire drill suggestions that we could share quickly, or maybe resources we could point people to?
All right, here we can't go through an episode of something like this without talking about AI. So here's what I'm going to say. If there's one thing that generative AI is like really awesome at that you can do today, is to plug in as a prompt a bunch of context about your organization and what you want to educate people on and what you want to sensitize them to, and have it come up with a fire drill scenario, a tabletop exercise, any type of exercise. And that's a really neat use case that where actually a hallucination might be a benefit.
Yeah, a little creativity from the. I love that. Yeah, let's use these new tools. That's what they're good. This is a perfect example. Thank you, Steve. That was awesome. CCL, I hope you took some notes. Before we get out of here, Steve, was there any story that was a thumbs up or an eye roller for you this week? Something you reacted strongly to in the news this week?
I think I'll say the statistics and looking at that Microsoft report around healthcare, there are a lot of different sources of statistics, and the quality varies. And so it's always sort of hard to figure out, between all these different organizations who are putting out these reports, what are the actual trends, where are the waves actually blowing. And I think in there was some encouraging news, but also still kind of a call to action, right? That as an ecosystem, and I exist in healthcare and support the healthcare ecosystem, it really takes all of us, and we have to lift up the entire sector. And so I think that's sort of the one for me, was just to think about what can we do in each part of healthcare that we exist in to lift the tide for everybody, and ultimately help Americans get the care they need at the time they need, and have it be financed and everything else, without disruption and sort of predictably. So that's where I kind of land. That was a little bit sobering, had some bits of encouragement, but also says the job's not done and it's going to take all of us.
Well, I'm going to agree with Sean Kelly in the chat here and say this was, if not cheery, that was the word Sean used, but I think empowering. This episode is all about empowering, taking the news, figuring out what lessons we can learn from it and how we can get better. I love that. Thank you so much, Steve Person, CISO over at Cambia Health. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise, your wisdom even. I really appreciate it. This was a blast.
Thanks, Rich. And it may be a very generous use of the word wisdom, but I appreciate you having me. Thanks.
Where can people find you online if they want to see what you're up to?
Yeah, if you want to reach out, I'm on LinkedIn under CISO Steve, or you can just look for my name, and happy to make connections.
Fantastic. Well, thank you once again. We'll have to have you on before too long, because this was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks also to our sponsor for today, Conveyor. Get instant AI answers to any spooky security questionnaire. Also, thanks to our audience today. Had some fantastic back and forth on there. We can't always get everything up on the screen, but know that you are deeply appreciated and you help make the show better. Make sure to come back next week for another episode of the Week in Review. And in the meantime, you can still get your daily news fix every single weekday through cybersecurity headlines. Give us about 6 minutes. We'll get you all caught up. Until the next time we meet, I'm Rich Stroffolino, reminding you to have a super sparkly day.
Cybersecurity headlines are available every weekday. Head to CISOSeries.com for the full stories behind the headlines.